Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at CPW for our Meet the Artist evening, which we host every Thursday night around 6 p.m. if we start on time. These are brought to you with a generous support from the Augusta and Arnold Newman Foundation. So that's why we're able to support artists in this way, and that's why we're able to make this free to the public. So we're very grateful for that. I have a couple announcements to make. First of all, if you haven't been here before, welcome. This is CPW, kind of Center Photography at Woodstock, but now we're CPW. So if you're curious about what the acronym means, we were formerly in Woodstock for 45 years. So we've been in Kingston for the last 4. So we're excited. Maybe we'll change the name one day, maybe not. Before we get started, if you haven't been here, our restrooms are on the 2nd floor. You can take this hallway up the black door or up the elevator onto the 2nd floor, and you'll find that there. You've probably seen on this slideshow, we have upcoming a photo book and zine fair in August. That's August 9th and 10th. It's a Saturday and Sunday. Each day will kick off with a free panel in this space right here from 11 to 12:30 probably. Day 1 is Decolonizing the Photo Book. That'll be moderated by Kiana Mestrich, and that will feature Kim Weston, Keisha Scarville, and her niece Davis. And then on Sunday, if you haven't got enough, we have 10 by 10's Russet Liederman. She's one of the editors of the Flashpoint Protest and Print. You may have seen the reading room in this room right behind me. And she'll be moderating conversation between Kiwi Hanley Byrne, D'Angelo Lovell-Williams, Marriott Pathy Allen, and Ashima Yadava, some of whom are literally featured in the reading room, but definitely in the book. So, and then after at 12, the fair kicks off. So the 2nd floor will have over 30 exhibitors, mostly local, I would say 75% local regional artists or publishers, and some from a little bit further. So I hope you'll join us. It's free to the public. There'll be some delicious food served as well, so come check that out. Otherwise, I'll get started for why we're all here today, which is to welcome Julia Weist here. Julia Weist's artistic practice is defined by a participatory aesthetic in which her artworks are shaped by the systems that they foreground as subjects. Across various mediums with a focus on photography, Weist is known for her deeply collaborative approach and the remarkable lengths she goes to gain access and build relationships. She is embedded with New York City government and Cuba's underground media networks. She won a National Advertising Award and collaborated with an FBI agent who was undercover in the art world. For 2 years, Weist was a licensed private investigator. The common thread between these projects is an interest in revealing the hidden intricacies that create and confer power. Her work is in the permanent collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Museum of Modern Art, Guggenheim Museum, Brooklyn Museum, Art Institute of Chicago, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and Jewish Museum, among other collections. She has recently exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, Art Institute of Chicago, Queens Museum, and The Shed, and internationally at the Hong Ga Museum in Taiwan, NGBK in Berlin, Kunstinstitut Meli Rotterdam, and Gwangju Biennale. Recent solo exhibitions include Private Eye at Moskowitz Bays and Governing Body at Rachel Uffner Gallery. Her latest public artwork campaign debuted in Times Square in 2022. So without further ado, let's welcome Julia up here. And if you have any questions about CBW, come find me afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really happy to be here for many reasons, but also because I make a lot of artwork here. So if you don't know this, the 2nd floor has an amazing digital media lab. So this is a photo of a piece I was working on recently up there with their copy camera. Alicia Is Alicia here? Yes. Shout out to Alicia, who is so amazing. The digital lab manager has supported so many of these projects. So I really want to acknowledge that tonight. So I'm going to speak about work I've made over the last 5 years, partially because it's a very neat arc that keeps folding in and in and in on itself, but also because I am not exclusively a photographer. I make work in a lot of different materials in my studio, but for the last 5 years, I've made a lot of lens-based work because of the formal and conceptual opportunities that it's provided. So I will explain that tonight. So I'm going to start in 2019. I was given a really amazing opportunity to, as we were saying in the intro, embed within New York City government for a year. I was commissioned to make a public artwork that was inspired by the Municipal Record Center or the Municipal Archive, which is an incredible collection that dates back to 1653. So as the date suggests, it's a colonizer's archive. It's all of the material made by New York City government in its own conception for hundreds of years. At the time, it was 243,000 cubic square feet of material in pretty much every format you can imagine. And this was really challenging while being really exciting because a very small portion of this collection is cataloged or digitized. So knowing where to begin was a real challenge. These photos I'm showing you, the public is not allowed to walk around in this warehouse, but I was given this special access, which I was really grateful for. But the public can request any material that's in any of these boxes. So trying to figure out where to begin, I leaned into that special access and I just take things off the shelf and see what I could find while being very careful to put it back in exactly the same spot. So for example, this is a box I pulled off that has a receipt from that was paid December 22nd, what does it say, 1883. Or for example, this is a register of voters from, it's very small on my screen, 1894. But I realized quickly that also there was tons and tons of more contemporary material, which is what I was really interested in. So here's just a box of tons of letters sent to David Dinkins, who was the mayor in the early 90s of New York City. And particularly within that contemporary material, I found myself drawn to documentation of the relationship between city government and artists, particularly over the last 100 years. So on the left, we see Jonas Mekis's mugshots. Of course, Jonas Mekas, the filmmaker, and a note that NYPD wrote that they thought he was a possible Russian agent. There's undercover notes of an officer who went to his film screening and sort of analyzed the film, but through this kind of lens of enforcement and surveillance. And some of these records, as I'm just describing, are so seductive and intriguing and complicated and problematic, but very sensational. But then on the right, a lot of the material is also just super dry. It's very bureaucratic. This is like a page from a grant application that the Center for Book Arts had in 1980. So it's a real range. And in making an artwork, I wanted to be aware that I was interested in my audience's eyes not glazing over and sort of shutting down by the kind of dry bureaucracy of this. So I started trying to develop some strategies to address that. So the first approach that I took was thinking about the aesthetics of the system of the archive. So for example, this is a record retrieval request form where if a member of the public wants to see material in a box in storage, they fill it out. It's one of these like carbon sheets where you write in pencil and there's like 4 different colored copies that all get this kind of receipt from what you've written on the top form. And I saw this as an opportunity to kind of crop and annotate some of the material I was finding down to its essential part that I was interested in making visible. I did have access to a darkroom. This used to be a chemical darkroom, and then it became a digital darkroom. So here you'll see a copy camera like the one I showed at the beginning that's here at CPW. This is the city's copy camera that I was able to use to make photographic images. So here's how it came together. There were 11 photographs that I made in this series, and this one is called Definitions. So it was just following the thread that I saw again and again in my research in the archive of different government agencies trying to define the word art, artwork, and artist, which sounds really simple. But even if I asked here for two people in the audience to give a definition of the word artwork, you can imagine it would probably be totally different. And now you can imagine that the definition that New York City government's Department of Employment made for that term is probably different than the one that comes from the Department of Cultural Affairs. So trying to show that span and also over a range of time was what this particular piece was concerned with. But there were other through lines that I found. For example, instances again and again where city employees or officials were asked to critique artwork. So this is like what we do in art school. It's the primary way we learn how to be artists, is hearing feedback from other people. And in this case, the folks that were giving the feedback didn't necessarily have any specialized training in art or art history. They were maybe an official at Health and Hospitals choosing an artwork for a wall, and that's the lobby, let's say, of a public hospital that was going to have some public art in it. And so I found the language really interesting and really refreshing, sometimes very racist, sometimes very myopic, sometimes very inspiring. It's really like this archive shows the whole mess that is the human project of a city and a municipal system and a civic life. So I tried to demonstrate that in these works. And the last one I'll show from this series, this will come back later, so remember this piece, but this is instances I found of government surveilling artists, sometimes arresting them. So that's, for example, where the Jonas Mekas mugshot wound up, and other instances where artists were fired for demonstrating their ideology or were sent to the House Un-American Activities Committee when they were working as part of the WPA. So a really range of histories, but the common thread being government investigating, surveilling, and sometimes punishing artists. So this is an installation view of that work at MoMA, but I was less interested in the kind of traditional ways that these works began to circulate in the art world. Like here's definition at the Met, but the way this worked was, as we know as photographers, it's a convention to edition prints. So the first edition of the print series remained in the custody of the city, but then Two and Beyond went and moved through the art world in sort of traditional ways. But I got excited about that first print of the edition and how it could exist in ways that were beyond what is typical for photographs. Because I was thinking about all the material in the archive that I had just spent a year wading through and researching, and how that material has been there for hundreds of years. And I was trying to think about how I could get my artwork into that context. So sort of, like I said before, folded back into the context from which it originated. So I did a lot of research into basically how things get classified as government records, getting really in the weeds of the policies. For example, this New York City Supplemental Records Retention and Disposition Schedule that outlines some of these terms. And I kind of made like a checklist of different things I could do that would make it really hard to argue that these artworks were not government records by the rules of the system. So for example, on the right, I sent a memo, official piece of correspondence to the commissioner of an agency, transferring the ownership of the prints and things like that. And the reason I was interested in this is there is a legal framework around government records, which, has anybody ever done a FOIL request? Freedom of Information Law request? Yes. So where this was most in people's popular imagination was with Hillary Clinton's emails. So you remember that scandal where James Comey was like, we think there's deleted emails. The reason that was a big deal is you're not allowed to destroy government records. That's why there's hundreds of years of warehouses of stuff in this archive. So I was thinking about if I could get my artworks classified in that way, it's another form of the type of longevity for artworks that we typically only associate with like a permanent museum collection, but it's accessible to the public, it's free, it's shepherded in a way that's really different. So I was successful in using my checklist to get them to be classified as government records. This is a screenshot of the New York City FOIL portal, where basically you put in a Freedom of Information Law request and the government has to serve you the records that you have requested. Remember this slide again, like that other artwork, because it's going to come back. But these are examples of, or this particular one is actually demonstration, that piece that was at MoMA. But here it's a request from a member of the public to the government to say, give me a copy of that government record. I have a right under this law to see it, to possess it. And in fact, the government provided high resolution copies of that artwork to not only the person who requested it, but now it's like posted on this government website. So it's accessible to everyone. And again, photography here has a sort of unique ability. These photos were made on that copy camera. They were born digital. The city had copies of those, and it's just able to circulate in this way that I thought was really interesting. So I had spent a year thinking about information that's public, that has to remain accessible, and I started getting very interested in the idea of the kind of opposite end of that spectrum. Data, information that's legally required or legally protected in its privacy. So things like people's social security numbers or other information that there's guidelines around disclosure and protecting that information. And I started wondering if there were members of the public or just sort of regular citizens who had access to that information. And it turned out that there was a simple answer to that question. Private investigators have access to that information. They're among the only kind of regular citizens who have these powers over the private record. And it turns out that anyone can apply to become a private investigator. Not everyone will be approved, but every state, through their Department of State, usually has a protocol where you can throw your hat in the ring and say, I'd like to become a private investigator. Now, normally, the folks who do this have been a police officer for at least 20 years, that's the requirement, or a fire marshal. And so I was looking through these rules, and I thought, I have not been a police officer, nor ever will be, and certainly not for 20 years. But there was this other category of qualification, and that was that you could have done professional investigations for at least 3 years in your career. And I thought, okay, well, I think of my art practice as investigative in nature. I've received these grants and large contracts, through like this Public Art Commission, for example, to investigate topics and then present them. So I filled out the application. It was a very extensive process. I sent in some of those contracts. I shared an unbelievable amount of like financial information and information about people I had worked with. And I also took a test, which I passed, a private investigator exam. I also passed an FBI background check. And then in November 2022, I was approved for the license. So I was surprised, but I always like to qualify that I was surprised because I've been an artist for 20 years, and I know that we're very confusing to people. It was not my expectation that on the first attempt, the state of New York would be like, I get this practice that's very conceptual, and we see how your argument makes sense that you're an investigator, we're going to give you this license. I figured I'd maybe have to work on appeal, provide other information before they sort of saw my side of this. But they let me through, and I immediately realized the power that this license was going to give me. So there are database products designed by corporations such as these that collect and sell data specifically to law enforcement, but also to private investigators and sometimes to corporations like fraud analysts at large insurance corporations, for example. So you can only access these tools if you have these credentials. And so I subscribe to one called IRB Search. This is an affiliate of LexisNexis, if you've ever used that as like an academic research tool. I just thought this line was great. You really are special to be getting access to this sensitive information. So the first artwork I made as a private investigator was a self-portrait. So as with the public record series that we looked at before, these are physical collages of paper that I photographed and made into a photographic print. Part of the reason that I was interested in photography for this is the unwillingness I had to allow this to be ever unmade as a collage, because there's a lot of sensitive data in there that's not just about me, but about like my neighbors, my family. And what photography allowed me to do was flatten that. It could never be undone, and thereby revealing information that somebody didn't consent to reveal. So what you're seeing here is everything of just such a wide range of information, but just to give you a flavor, you can see images of my car. This is where I was, parking on the street, when I was stopped at stoplights, things like that. But also everywhere I had lived for the last 30 years, my IP address, my cell phone carrier, the amount of money I made 20 years ago in a pay period in my student worker job, just if you can imagine it, it was in there. And the way that I design the aesthetics of this is a similar logic to the last project, where I wanted to show the visual logic of the system. So I looked up New York State's brand guidelines. They have a brand guideline, like they have colors and fonts and things like that, which I referenced here with the blue and the orange and shades of yellow and red. And I am legally required to keep a log of the searches that I do as a private investigator, because there's a lot of legal frameworks around, as I mentioned before, around the sensitive data. And you can be audited and say, what is the legal purpose that you had to access this search on this individual, let's say. So the requirement to have a log kind of created this opportunity where I needed a paper trail. And like with the last project, I used that paper trail and this sort of play between transparency and opacity to crop and annotate the information that I was providing. So this is another work made with my PI license that tries to show how sweeping the access to this information is, even within this legal framework. So there's something called a wildcard search, where a PI can know one piece of information. For example, there is an individual in the town of East Durham, that's the town I live in, who owns a Subaru Legacy in this year range, which is the car that I owned at the time. And knowing that one piece of information, you can do a wildcard search and say, show me everyone in that town that has a car that matches that. And that's legally permissible because it's a search on that one person that you have the right to look up. So in this piece, you can see, again, parts are obscured to protect privacy, but it's everything from which bank owns the lease on that car, all the previous registrations of that individual's plates, their address for the last many years. So just to try to give a sense of the kind of scale of information you get back for one valid, quote unquote, valid search. Again, a physical collage that was made into a photograph. Okay, so another tool that PIs can use allow you to look up a car's license plate and see where it is. That's how in my self-portrait, my Subaru was captured in all of these different places. But I realized very quickly that you can actually search for basically any text in this tool. It's not what it's designed for, but it's something that you can use this database to do. So for this piece, I searched for the word proud, and this is a small subset of many, many, many huge trove of data I received of images of Americans who have a bumper sticker on their car that says proud. So here is a real ideological range from proud ally to proud to hire American, just to show also geographically in the satellite images that this is not something that's like in one part of the country, hitting one type of community. This is a broad mass surveillance state that's happening everywhere within our country's borders. And this is what the database serves you. So you get the image of the car, but then you also get a satellite view of where that photo was taken, in addition to a ton of other metadata, like how many times the car has been seen in that location, how frequently that car is seen at daytime versus nighttime, which you can imagine could be used in various ways. For example, as it is by car insurance providers to try to figure out, do you street park your car? Do you drive mostly at night? Maybe you have a night job. And those things can be used to hold back the pillars of stability in American life, like car insurance, but then as with the other data that you saw in the self-portrait, access to housing, access to a job, right? When people do a background check and see all this information. Which is not always accurate too. So just to be clear, this system where you can search for any text does not actually need a car to be in the photo, even though this is a system designed to run license plates. So to demonstrate that, I searched for the word believe, and these are images that you can see. It's on trash cans and throw pillows on people's front porch, and even on a piece of clothing in the detail shot. You can see it's a little hard to make out at this scale, but it's somebody's sweatshirt that says believe. So I'm going to come back in a little bit to like the many ways I think this is terrifying, but just to pause for a second, because I know this is a crowd of photographers, I want to talk about the camera that's used to take these images. So this is the camera. It's made by Motorola Corporation, and it's designed for tow trucks, also for police vehicles, and I have an image of that as well. But the idea here is that a tow truck has 2 of these cameras on each side, and as it's driving around to, for example, try to repossess a vehicle for someone who stopped paying the lease on a car and the dealership is trying to extract that vehicle back, the tow truck is driving around looking for that car, and these cameras can find the license plate and give like a ding, 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 and the tow truck stops and tows the car. So if you believe that this is a valid thing that should be done, even putting that aside, there is no reason for these cameras to take a photo of everything they see. They don't need that to do their job. But there is money to be made in that surveillance. And so Motorola has designed this where the truck drivers use this tool and then they get all the photos. So to give you a sense of the finances behind this, when a tow truck captures 7 million license plates a month, they get $7,000, which sounds crazy. Like, how could you get 7 million license plates a month for one tow truck? But if you imagine, I spoke to many of the drivers of these trucks who work in 12-hour shifts from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. They're driving down a city block. There's maybe 30 cars, I don't know, on that block. And then 12 hours a day, they're just circling block after block. You can imagine how really quickly this becomes a really massive system. So this is Motorola's graphic for how it is used on police cars. Okay, so I learned so much about these cameras and the trucks and spoke to the drivers and figured out how this system operated to such a degree that I started thinking about that camera as a camera that I could use to make photographs. So I wasn't, pulling the trigger or hitting the shutter, but I was able to understand how and when it would fire, and I could stage a photo for that moment when it fired. So here I'm sitting on the block of a repo yard that I identified in Brooklyn participates in this network. I waited until the tow trucks drove by me. I ran the license plate of the car I'm sitting next to using my private investigator license, and I found this image of myself, which then obviously I appropriated and used as an artwork as a traditional self-portrait. I did other forms of intervention, like I made this sign that are, some are more confrontational in nature, like where is the public? This tool is literally used to find members of the public, but it's also asking this question, like, this is public space, right? These tow trucks are driving down public streets. But when they're collecting information at this scale, there's no notion of our traditional sense of public and private, where it's like, you don't have a right to privacy on a city street because anyone could see you walking. It's a different metric when the person who sees you walking has maybe never stood on that street. Maybe they're looking 6 years later. So trying to bring up some of these questions around the commons and how technology has changed what we assume is like the previous definition of a public square. So some more kind of poignant. This was a rose that I put on that same Subaru, and I just think that some of the kind of cropping and the composition here with this horizontal layout presented a lot of opportunities. These photos are very low res because, as you can imagine, you know, there's millions being collected and storage and all of that. So they're presented quite small. On the left is the framed version. They're like 3 inches tall because basically after 3 inches they kind of fall apart as an image. So I wanted to capture the tow truck in the photo. So I experimented with mirrors. So I put mirrors on the car so it would like reflect the moment of photography. But the cameras really got really confused by the mirrors. So it's really hard to see, not in a physical form. But if you are so inclined, it actually is on view right now at the Dorsky Museum at SUNY New Paltz. But you can see there is the small figure of the tow truck in the mirror in this photo. But I wasn't totally satisfied that I had like documented this tow truck completely, like through this one piece. And then I had the epiphany that tow trucks have license plates. So I could just run the tow truck's license plate and see images that they were accidentally taking of each other. So this piece is called Watching the Watcher. And you can see I ran the license plate 2418TT. And this shot gives a really great view of the cameras, right? Because it's kind of like a close-up. I was very compelled by some of the images that I found in this set. I don't blame these tow truck drivers for this mass surveillance state. I feel that probably somebody would do another job if they could, if they had to work 12-hour shifts surveilling their neighbors. Everybody is trying to survive in America. And I found some of these shots just like full of some of that complicated emotion. So for example, this is a photo that the truck took of its driver with the open door and this strange dawn light or whatever's happening there. This is an image that one truck took of another truck's driver. And then just like lots of strange moments, you know, like this finger touching the body of the truck was really interesting to me. Okay, so getting back to why I think this is so terrifying is you can imagine it's really easy to use tools like this to find evidence of ideological affiliations. So this is a bumper sticker both for and against abortion. Presidential candidates, you know, on a registered address or registered vehicle. And, you know, this is where you might get some pushback. Like this person chose to put out a lawn sign that's publicly announcing their ideological affiliation. But that person was maybe doing it with the idea that their neighbors would see it or whoever drove by, and that it would be for a fixed period of time. But as I said before, this could be seen by somebody who's never been on this block many years later. And most people don't know that this surveillance is happening. They think, oh, I know my neighbor doesn't have a security camera, so whatever I do on this front lawn, if I don't see anyone watching, it's in private, but of course it's not. So I wanted to try to talk about my experience of kind of being behind the curtain for a couple years. So I wrote an op-ed. This was in the Albany Times-Union, because a lobbyist told me that the Albany Times-Union is the paper that lawmakers read, because of course our state capital is in Albany, and the op-ed is where lobbyists use quite frequently. They use it as a platform for sharing their opinions. So I made this op-ed. I also worked with an investigative journalist from Wired to kind of get into some of the technical detail of these cameras and some of the surveillance systems that I was working with. So little did I know at the time that this would come back to me in many ways. So at the same time that I published this op-ed, I did my first solo exhibition of this body of work. It was in Los Angeles. So it was all becoming public at the same time. And then about 2 months later, I get an email from the New York State Department of State, and they asked me, they didn't say why, but they said I had to come to this building in Albany on November 4th, 2024 at 11 a.m. And they brought me to a windowless conference room, and seated across from me was the Deputy Chief Investigator for New York State, John A. Goldman, and there was also a lawyer for the Department of State and a senior investigator. And over several hours, they asked me a lot of questions about my use of the PI license, how I came to be licensed to begin with, which was, to be clear, a process that they approved. And so this was one of the full circle moments for me, because I was just thinking back to this piece where I was an artist invited in and embedded within government. I made this work about artists being surveilled and investigated by their government. And then I was in this room and they were asking me questions that involved me describing this artwork to them. So again, folding back and sort of always thinking about going deeper. So they asked me a huge range of questions. One of the things they were really focused on was how other people understand what it is that I do. So do other people think of me as an investigator? So for example, and again, this is really small on my screen, but essentially they are saying, okay, and we touched on Canopy, that's Triple Canopy. Do people know the art nonprofit Triple Canopy? Do you know the title you were working under at that publication? And I said, I did not have a particular title. They published, again, similar to Rachel Effner Gallery. They saw value in the work product. Work product was what they called artwork. And they published it, and it aligned with their mission. If you ask them, what is Julia? What is her role? They would say artist/investigator. And senior investigator Berendt said, would they have said that back in 2020 when you received payment? So I left the room, I went back to my studio, and I started making artwork that answered these questions. So for example, yes, in 2020, Triple Canopy used the word investigate to describe what it was I was doing for them. And you can see the payment documentation there with my 1099. So what I'm trying to do in these works that came out of the experience of this essentially a deposition with them was create artwork that answered the questions that they had about if I was ever qualified to have this license to begin with, did I break any rules when I was using the license? Is making artwork a valid use of a private investigator license in general? But in such a way that I could present my argument, my answer to these questions, which sometimes is quite straightforward. The answer is yes, here are the receipts. But sometimes it's a little bit more obscure. It is really difficult to describe as artists when we get paid and for what and through what mechanisms. So I wanted to create images that used a kind of combination of litigation aesthetics and art materials. So here we have a cutting mat and like a loop or a magnifying glass, but also these classification folders, which lawyers tend to use to organize evidence and paperwork and things related to trials. So, shopping on legalsupply.com, finding these materials that are used in a courtroom. Because I just figured that the solution was to learn where we meet. So like I use the word artwork, they use the word work product. A visual example of that is are there things that they use, things that I use, that can find a middle ground for us where we can be speaking the same language and talking about what it is that I have been doing for many years and what it is that I did with this license. And just to remind you, this photograph was made upstairs. Yay, CPW. So here's another one, Queens Museum. They also use the word investigate. So to answer another one of their questions, which was all of the searches I did as a PI, again, there's a legal framework around when you can do that. I came up with these strategies that also used techniques that found in other industries for how to handle sensitive information. So for example, medical records are protected by HIPAA, right? A doctor can't just share your medical files. And so there are medicalsupply.com. There are stickers that are used for the outside of folders. Sometimes has a patient's partial name. It can indicate if they have an allergy, a date of birth, things like that. But otherwise, it's meant to inform someone as to what's inside the folder without showing that. And so I use this as a tool for making a kind of information visualization of every search I did as a PI and the law under which I was allowed to do so. So to give you a sense, GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, that's one of the laws. Subsection 2 is authorized by the subject of that search. Subsection 3, as you can see is there as well, is for use in a legal proceeding. So some of the work that I did was used in trials. There's various different use cases here that I visualized in this way. And you can see it's a lot, but the majority of those searches, the ones you see in the middle, that's that big section, are not governed by law, and that is the license plate information. So there is currently no legal framework restricting when those can be accessed, which is why I was able to do things like just search for the word believe without knowing someone who has believe on their license plate. So in addition to all the work this is doing within the project and within my practice, I'm also trying to indicate the system at large and where some of the flaws might be in that system. Okay, so I'm going to reveal something here that I have actually never revealed because it's very recent, but about, I guess, a couple weeks ago now, I get a phone call from the Department of State, and they said, we're dropping the case. And I was like, tell me more. Because as you can imagine, I was very confusing to them because I wasn't totally upset that they were investigating me. It was actually a success for the project because it made an interaction, a conversation happen between me and the stakeholders of this system. It was kind of the ultimate conclusion that one could hope for when doing work like this. So when I asked, tell me more, they said you can request your case file. So of course, immediately request my case file. And through what mechanism? The Freedom of Information Law. So another moment where this became really full circle. So last week, I got the first trove of documents. They thought it was the only trove of documents they were going to give me. I'm calling it the first trove of documents. It was about 250 pages. And again, I'm interested in the aesthetics of systems. So like this sheet was really exciting to me because this is a printout of my gallery's website. This is the page for the exhibition I did that I mentioned the first time I made this public in a solo show. You can see here, it's in black and white, but you might recognize that self-portrait that I showed you. And at the top on the upper right is this handwritten number, which is my case file number. So here it's the work I've done and it's like literally inscribed. It's like literally annotated by the state. So I thought that was really interesting. And a majority of this 250 pages of the FOIL response that they gave me was things like this. It was basically printouts of the internet, which was really interesting, but also I already know all of that. Like I put this on the internet, But there were 2 pages that were really the only evidence of their work. So the first page was the piece of paper that started this whole thing. It's called a hold card notice. So they put a hold on me within the Department of State, meaning I couldn't apply for new licenses, I couldn't renew licenses, I couldn't do anything that they had power over. And you can see here it says reason for hold, and it just says see me, and it's signed by Goldman, the deputy chief investigator. So one strategy when you work in government and you know everything you do can be foiled and made public and is meant to be transparent is just to not write things down, which is what they did. So this was the first strategy and this was this moment where I was like, we are playing chess, because they are showing me that they are using these strategies. They gave me 248 pages of stuff I already knew and 2 pages showing me that they didn't write stuff down, right? Or when they did write stuff down, they perhaps wrote it in Romani, the language of the Roma people, which is what the second sheet of handwritten notes is characterized by. So Romani is difficult to translate because, as you can imagine, it's diasporic in nature. So it's really more like a collection of dialects. But you can never underestimate the power of artists who organize and work together to do things they can't do on their own. So for example, I am on a listserv of artists, Shout out Josh Klein, he and Annika Yee, who started this listserv. And there's always crazy stuff on there. Somebody's like, I need to like powder coat a pumpkin, any recs? And literally people are always like, yeah, I got a guy, So I put the question out there. I'm looking to translate a couple, just basically one page of Romani. Can somebody help me? And within 15 minutes, I had a Romani expert, PhD linguist, Google natural language processor engineer who, has deep familial and personal historic ties to this, as well as this sort of academic relationship. And he was like, yeah, give me $50. I'll translate this for you. So the thing that I thought was interesting was twofold. The first was there was only one question that appeared multiple times. And, that the note taker, senior investigator Brent, was writing. And I think that's really revealing, right? If you've only one page of notes and you're writing the same question again and again, it's important to you. And the question was, why does she want the license? The other thing I thought was interesting were these symbols that at first I thought maybe were doodles, but then of course the arrow pointing to canopy, 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 spelled differently than they spell it, suggested otherwise. So I'm still in the process of fully decoding this, but from what I understand, what I assume is going to turn out to be the answer is that these are ciphers. They're like symbols meant to mean certain things. And I've gotten as far as understanding that the two on the top are related to work for money, work like good, recurring, stable work. And then the ones on the bottom potentially mean friendly and generous, because I was not being antagonistic in this deposition because I was thrilled to be there. So what happens next is I appealed. This basically goes to a person with more authority than the person who processed the first FOIL request, where they get to say, yes, you can see more, or no. They did claim they did say that they withheld information and they gave a legal reason why, like protecting the privacy of the government workers, probably because they saw that obviously all of this becomes public in my practice. But so I'm appealing. And for example, one of the things that I hope to get is the video recording that they made of that meeting in the windowless conference room. If they deny the appeal, then I can sue, which maybe isn't exciting to everybody, but it's very exciting to me. So I think maybe I'll leave it there. We can take some questions. Yeah, sound good? Yes, in the back. So presumably the investigator, it's a language that they speak fluently, maybe a native language. And it's another strategy for making, if you have to write something down, which then can be made public, it just makes it a lot harder to interpret or understand. Mm-hmm.
What were the pictures of the shirts about?
Pictures of the shirts
in that one with the government.
Oh, yeah. Here, we can go back there. This one? Yeah. So this is actually also, this is excerpting from a piece that's also at the Dorsky right now. But as was mentioned in the intro, I worked with a retired FBI agent who was undercover in the art world. And he, at my request, engaged with me about how you can be convincing as an artist. So sometimes, especially living outside of a city center, maybe some of the artists in this room can have their own experience with this. But as I said before, we're very confusing. So you go to the bank and you're opening an account, and the person's like, "What do you do for a living?" And you're not actually convincing them that you're an artist, because they're like, "Oh, like a wedding photographer, or do you make paintings or something?" And I'm like, "No, I sue the government," or whatever it is, and it doesn't make sense. And so, coming from the emotional urgency of that was this conversation that wound up. Robert K. Whitman is his name. Agreed to annotate photographs of every piece of clothing I owned, and told me the outfits in which I looked most convincingly like an artist. Yeah. So that's an excerpt from that piece.
And were these the most artistic? You said-
Yeah, they were among them.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Do you find yourself looking at car licenses all the time now?
Okay, so I actually, more so than looking at car license, I find myself looking at tow trucks. So when I pass a tow truck on the highway, I always immediately, my head snaps to see if they've got the cameras. And actually, recently I was with my family. We were having a nice walk to the beach, and there was like a police car sort of directing traffic. And I was like, stop, you see those cameras? And they're like, we're just going to the beach. So shout out to my family. Did you have a second question?
Yeah, the second question is, have you noticed a lot of people sandblasting their license plates around this area?
So I haven't noticed in this area, but I know that they were trying to crack down in New York City on, and actually Adam Dean, who's in the back, was the one who turned me on to this, but it was like a leaf with a magnet on the license plate, and you'd press this button and it would like come on or off to obscure part of the license plate so that people could get out of paying tolls, what's it called, congestion pricing, things like that. So I haven't haven't noticed the sandblasting, but I know it's a thing because so much has gone like without a machine or without a toll booth or whatever, except a camera that's looking at the license plate. So I know it's a thing. Is it a thing here?
I take photos of it now, so that's kind of a collection for me now.
Yeah, and that might be why, yeah, here, I'm gonna,
The license plate reader, you have images, but there's no view.
yeah.
So those cameras are continuously rolling, and what triggers them is that when you're going by a house, there's a political sign in it, no vehicle.
Right.
Trigger your photograph.
The text. So the cameras are trained to look for text. And when we did the Wired article, one of the reasons I really like to work with journalists is they can ask questions that people are more likely to answer than if like an artist calls up Motorola Corporation and is like, can you tell me why these photos are here with no vehicles in them? So a spokesperson for Motorola addressed that question directly from Wired, that they were like, how come, you have these images in your system that are like not what you said the system is supposed to do? And also, as I mentioned, it's not governed by federal law. So like these sort of exceptions take on a different significance. And they sort of dodge the question, but they just always redirect towards public safety. So they'll say like, our systems are used to find kidnapped children and to keep car insurance low, which is, as I mentioned, it's low because they're exploiting specific individuals potentially. And then, do you have a second question? Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So just the street address or the number on a house trigger the camera if the number is big enough?
I mean, it depends. It was clear that it wasn't every single house, because I think there would be a lot more results. I think it's one of these things that is probably like not a bug, it's a feature, but it's not like designed to do it. So if you were trying to be really methodological about it, I think you could probably make a couple tweaks to the system where it would like really photograph every house. And they're not expressly trying to turn it into a system that does that. But, and some people might say like, well, what about like Google Street View, where you can like press the advance, and you can see it. Two things. One, Google Street View, the license plates are blurred, as are the faces of individuals. And two, Google Street View is browse. This is search. So it's really different to like put in an address and go click, click, click and see what's there than it is to put in like Planned Parenthood and see all the Planned Parenthood. It's so much more powerful when you can direct it rather than just browse with one known address.
Do those cameras work at night also?
Yes. So I think they're in this work that I included in the slideshow. You might not be able to see it. Yeah. No. There's a couple in these series where it's really wild because it's almost like completely black, and then there's like this hot flash of the white of the license plate that it has technology to like be able to see in like all sorts of lighting conditions. Your question?
Amazing. I have a question. I've had this suspicion for a while. I have no basis for it. I haven't really done research, but you'd be the person to ask. And what made me think to ask you is you had shown that this like technology for the cameras, it's like it serves its purpose as to maybe like why like that these tow trucks are getting in order to like work with other companies in order to like somehow produce more money. And then on top of that, they just sort of feed this database. But it made me think about how, well, first of all, like, you mentioned that, so, okay, my theory is that I did a hard check on my credit at one point, right? And it came out clear. A couple weeks later, I had to do it again, and I noticed that I had this, like, thing pop up after 7 years. And I wondered if those credit agencies are offering services to, or if these companies, like say an energy company, has like private investigator, like licensed people who work internally that look for hard pulls that people do, so that if they want to sort of like ensure that they're gonna pay something, that they kind of wait until it's gonna be really important for them, and they need to kind of clean their credit up. And that connection between like banks and private investigators and sort of like, you know, ways that they're sort of picking up extra cash or made me think, like it just seems so weird that this hard credit showed no thing, and then 2 weeks later there was like a derogatory mark from a 7-year-old bill that was like about to disappear. And it made me wonder, like again, it made me wonder about all these different companies, like why you chose IRB search, like, and
It was the cheapest.
and do you think that like all of these companies also, are they allowed access to this information, like a bank or an insurance company, or do they have to have like an employee that has that special private investigator's license that can sort of do some sleuthing in order to sort of like find ways to increase revenue and find out what people are doing and where they're using it?
Right, so I pulled up this slide because you can see that one of these products is owned by TransUnion. So it's a separate offshoot from the credit bureau. The parent company is TransUnion, which is one of the 3 major credit bureaus. Their product for COPS and PIs is called TLOXP. So to answer your question, there is a law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is just, I mean, there's more in the law, but it's focused on who can access a credit report on you. And a PI use is not valid for that law. So technically, that's not something that I would be able to do on somebody that I'm investigating without a consent to a credit report. There is something, I believe this is like outside of my expertise as a PI, but I think that credit reports actually just log when you view your own credit and ding you for it, which is the most American and most insane thing in the world. Somebody who's, you know, more informed should answer that question because I believe that's the case, but outside of my field of expertise. But I wanted to come back here to show you this detail in the orange. You'll remember I said about how I was able to purchase information about how much money I made in a pay period 20 years prior. So it was like 2004, and it had like, you know, and it went beyond that, but that was the oldest in the record. And interestingly, that apparently is outside of like the credit reporting law. It's a totally separate product called the Work Number, I believe, from Experian, I think it is. Google this and you will find it. And everyone should do that because you can freeze this data so that PIs who might be, or companies who might be doing a background check before an apartment that you're trying to get or a job can't just see payroll information about you. For example, let's say you're applying for a job and you say, yes, I consent to a background check because you think, I didn't do anything wrong. You might not realize that that gives them the right to see how much money you're making at your current job through this product. But they can't see it even if you consent, if you've frozen the data. So everyone should go home and freeze it. But just to say that there are these kind of areas where this should be under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Like, how is that not considered a credit report? Or and plus, you know, like showing your earnings. It also includes union affiliations, how many sick days and vacation days you took, if your employer is participating and entered that data. So yeah, it's all quite terrifying and very extractive. But if part of my goal in doing work like this and trying to talk about it in settings like this is to just make people aware, because when you're aware, there are some tools like that freeze that you can do that just give yourself a little bit more protection. Oh my gosh, so many questions. Yes.
I was wondering if you noticed any difference in patterning between rural and urban areas.
Like for the license plate?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had an image here of another work that I did that's similar to Proud. I did one that was Honk, and I purposely included this one image in that piece where it was the satellite image showed it was just so remote. Like it was just these huge fields with like one road running through the entirety of the thing. And the photo was taken there, and it was, of course, somebody parked in the snow, and the bumper sticker said, honk if you're horny. It was like so perfect. But just to show that, like, yes, it is much more dense in cities because there's more money to be made. They can just collect more license plates and then therefore make more money. So they're more likely to participate. But it is everywhere. I will say that with my own car, living upstate, but then often going to the city, over the couple years I was regularly running it, doing these projects, it was like tenfold how, every single time I went into the city, there were new results. And then up here, it'd be like, it'd take months. So there is some of that. And again, it's not about ideology or anything. It just comes down to the financial structure and like how people get paid to collect this information. Yes.
When you were investigating yourself,
Mm-hmm.
did you learn anything about yourself?
Well, in a spiritual sense. But no, I mean, nothing that surprised me. The thing that I learned was about other people. And this is what I keep trying to like emphasize is like with this piece, how much there is related to other people. Because, for example, in the data about myself, there was the name of the LLC of the current neighbor of a house that I haven't lived in 20 years. And the data showed that I hadn't lived there in 20 years. And yet they were still serving me this information about this person who very likely I would have absolutely never crossed paths with. So that was really shocking. And, there's always ways that these companies argue this, like, oh, those are like associates. There's like, could be connections between these people. But I think logically, most people can understand that if you haven't lived there in 20 years, their LLC has nothing to do with you, Somebody else was, yeah, right, yes.
I was curious, I noticed that they served you with paperwork last November, maybe 2 weeks before your license was about to expire.
Right.
I was curious, did you reapply for the license? Did that trigger something?
Yeah, I had already submitted my renewal application like weeks before that, but I could tell once I got the FOIL results that they opened the investigation the day, or maybe it was, I have to look back at the calendar, it's either the day or the day after, like 24 hours later, when I wrote the op-ed. So in Albany, yeah. Well, I did it to get the lawmakers' attention, hoping they would be like, we should do something about this. And, also I should say, I didn't just leave it there. I contacted Hinchy, who's my rep, and some other local representatives who were really responsive and have continued to remain in dialogue with them about it. But yeah, it was definitely the op-ed. And actually they mentioned that too in our exchange. They said that there was a tone and that the tone of the op-ed offended some people in their agency. And like, I'm empathetic to that. Like, you're there doing a job and you believe in it. But my tone was not, again, I don't focus on the individual. I don't judge anyone for participating in these systems if they feel that they want to or they have to. The issue I take is the systemic and also the secrecy and trying to show the inner workings of these systems for which their restricted nature is its own cover, right? If you don't have access to these systems because you're not credentialed, how do you know what they contain? And that's one of the things that I'm, trying to do here. How are we doing on time? Should I take like a couple more questions or one more question? 10 more minutes? Okay, yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering what you're thinking about working on next, given that there is administration in Washington that's taking a wrecking ball to all many of the barriers and guardrails to
Right.
connect individuals and the data and the information. And more open doors for companies like Palantir.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what are you thinking about as future projects?
Yeah, so the FOIL material. Sorry, I don't want to burn your eyeballs with that, but is interesting to me because it's essentially pure bureaucracy. It's the layer of this system where the system is just using its own gears, and to a certain extent, bureaucracy has really been a focus of this current federal, authoritarian administration, where they take aim at it, but they also sort of use it. And this idea that if there isn't a rule expressly written, then you just do the thing, right? So many of the things that Trump is doing, certainly not all of them, but many of them, it's like there's no rule that a president can't do that because no one could ever imagine a president would try. And so there is a little bit of a parallel in the sense that there is no rule, or there hadn't been up to this point, that you can't get a private investigator license and use it entirely to make artwork. So I think, not to say that I agree with this strategy of doing things but to call attention to it as a strategy. And the same way that there is a strategy of just, trying to not write things down or trying to withhold stuff, like all the fuss right now about the Epstein files and about when they can be released and the rules by which they can hold them back. I mean, it is an extension of similar systems where they didn't release these files because they said they had a reason, even though they concerned me and I was in the room for that video recording, but they wouldn't give it to me. So I think just the more we understand how these systems work, and especially from creative angles or unexpected angles, the better we are prepared to address when this is done for harm and not for culture and for conversation. Okay, maybe last question.
Thank you so much. I have a question about what artists you find most inspiring, or what practices that you find very interesting. Particularly, I'm thinking about an exhibition that was up in MoMA in 1970, and there was a piece there, a fine artist whose name I forget, who went and took photos of every single property that
Hans Hacke.
Yes.
Yeah.
And your work really reminds me of that.
He did teach at the very small art school that I went to.
So yeah, I just wanted to know about what practices.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in a moment right now that I shouldn't say this out loud. I mean, we sort of did already, I guess, but because sometimes that jinxes it. But I'm really interested in trying to look at other artists who work in similar ways to the way I'm working in these projects that I think have been misidentified as research-based artists. So this is coming out of a conversation I had with the artist Jill Magid about how that term is really useful in some ways because it's sort of legible outside the art world, everybody knows what research is. But it's also sort of limiting because this is, I believe, going far beyond just doing research in a library archive and kind of putting it on the wall. So some of the artists that I look at besides Jill in that way are people like Cameron Rowland, Gala Boris Kim, Jeremy Toussaint Baptiste, Golden and Senebe, just people who are like Chloe Bass, people who are interested in the kind of moving it beyond the intellectual and kind of bringing it back into some kind of participatory space or an interaction with the system that it's focused on. And I'm hoping that we can, do an exhibition. We're in very early stages of this, something that kind of bring some of those things together to try to offer new language that's a little bit more precise about what it is we're doing. Because I think that when you have language, it makes things more visible and presents it as a valid way of working. Not that I need the validation, but that it suggests to future generations or people who are not currently working as an artist, or that these are strategies that can be effective and can be interesting and inspiring, and you can be part of a community of people who do it. So we'll see what happens with that. All right, thank you so much.